Thank you, Punacha. Welcome to Africa Rising. As mentioned, I'm founder of Rosenzweig and Company and board chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. I've also supported friends like Dikembe Mutombo and Sherry Silver as they work so diligently to improve the lives in places of importance, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. On the economic front, I'm advisor to Good Light Capital and its partner Unified States Group as they invest in the continent with a focus on upward mobility for all the people of Africa. Africa presents tremendous opportunities. 9 out of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. Yet issues like human rights and wealth inequality remain significant. Our Raoul Wallenberg Center works hard to raise awareness of these issues and to promote actions in order to ensure that all peoples have the opportunity to thrive securely and freely. But one thing I've learned is that Africans want to tell their own stories rather than relying on others who look at things through a different and often biased lens. So let's meet our panelists. Tebi, founder of Brand Africa. Tebi has said that vibrancy, entrepreneurship, and resilience are central to Africa's dynamic nations. Sanjay Salil, media entrepreneur and founder of Media Guru, bringing a developing nation perspective to our discussion. And Gina, founder of Gina Dean Communications and author of Daughter of Africa. So let's begin with Tebi. Tebi, you've been quoted as saying that vibrancy, entrepreneurship, and resilience help characterize and connect Africa's dynamic countries. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, if you look at our continent, it's a continent that 54 countries. I've been to every single one of them, and in that continent is a continent that people when they look at us from us and say it's poverty. They look at it from a negative lens. They look at it poverty. They look at it from diseases, and they look at it all those. But what's interesting about it is that the people who are saying that about the continent have never been to the continent. I mean, there's a statistic from a recent survey that 63% of the people who write about the continent have never been to the continent. And if you look at the books that are written about Africa, they're written by non-African. But if you get to go to the continent, then you get to understand that it's a very entrepreneurial continent. I mean, this is a continent where some of the best innovations in mobile money and technology emanate from. And if you look at from 400 years of slavery and colonialism, and yet we are still standing. So we're a very resilient continent that cannot be destroyed by anything.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Talk about entrepreneurship. Gina, you're an accomplished Kenyan businesswoman and the author of Daughter of Africa, a moving and inspirational autobiography. Why are women's stories particularly important in the African narrative?
So I wrote my book, and it was a project that I did during COVID, and I, at that time, thought it would be about my own story. And then I took my book around the continent, and I realized the power and the strength and the resilience of other African women's stories. And I realized how few women's stories there are from the continent in bookshops. So if you go into a bookshop, there are very few books written by African women. And so, you know, I've made it my passion and my drive to try and collect as many stories of African women whose voices really need to be amplified, whose stories are ones of strength, grit, and resilience, and to try and bring back the tradition that we've had as Africans of telling stories. So I'm very, very excited to be on this journey to try and collect as many stories of African women.
Fabulous. Sanjay, you run an end-to-end media services company, Media Guru. How can African countries do a better job, let's say, of marketing and storytelling?
So before I answer that question, let me tell you how did I reach Africa for the first time. So
Absolutely.
It was 2008. A friend of mine from London, she called me, would you like to do a master class in media in Nigeria? I said, you must be kidding, Nigeria out of all the places in Africa? So I said, no, but I used to be a journalist. So I said, so next day, I said, give me 24 hours. And then next day I thought, let me go to Nigeria, how does it feel? It was incredible experience from so many angles. But what was most incredible was, by the time I finished my lecture, and I had a flight at 8 a.m. next day, so the CEO, one of the CEO took me to, he said, would you like to meet my chairman? And I didn't know who is the chairman, what was this organization. So it was 2 a.m. roughly. I said, okay, before I go to the airport, I would go and see this gentleman. I reached there and I see 300 people sitting, waiting to meet that gentleman. So I met him. He said, how much, first question, how much money will it take to set up a TV station? I said, depends. CNN could be set up at $1 billion. It could be set up at $5 million, $1 million. Depends what is that you want to do. So he said, he gave me an idea and I said, maybe $10, $12 million. He said, that must be cheap because I have a proposal for $25 million. And then I woke up. I could see at least 10, 12 Range Rovers in his campus. I said, do you know which company owns this Range Rovers? I said, this is Tata, an Indian company. I said, so he said, and why I'm saying this, telling you this story, he told me to wait. He signed a contract with me. And then I asked him, you don't even know me. Why did you do this? He said, very few people tell me that I'm wrong. So that is why I'm signing this contract to you. So it has been an incredible journey. And I can't agree more with what Kevin said, is that most of the people make perception about Africa without even visiting to Africa once. I would also like to quote what Gary said, that 99.999% people are nice people, no matter where they are. And still we focus so much on that negativity of point, whatever is left. So coming back to your question, sorry, I went
no, it's great context.
Yeah. But coming back to your question, I think what some of the African countries can learn from India is how to do things more wisely. I'm using the word wisely. How to do it, spend less money, still get the work done. I think this is one of the key things, because resource has been a challenge for India, and resource is a big challenge for Africa. So that is one thing I think is one. Second, countries like United States, Europe, they have been progressing for a long time. And they have gone through the entire life cycle of technology. When I went to Africa, I said, but how do I send you a fax? They said, what is fax? So there was no concept of a fax machine in Africa, in Nigeria and this part of these countries, because they did not look at that technology at all. And that has been another big thing in Africa, that we set up TV stations and all the TV stations that you see in Africa are completely integrated newsroom systems. So very high quality. So these are 2-3 learnings they can have from countries like India.
Yeah, I just want to complete your thought. Well, the last time I saw fax was 1988 when I came to America. It was the first, so, because you know, us Africans, we've skipped all those legacy things. We went straight to digital.
Exactly.
I wanted to,
that is my point.
I wanted to complete your thought that what we're trying to do now is to learn from the Arabs. The Arabs realize that when CNN tells story, they tell it from an American perspective. When BBC tells story, they tell it from a British perspective. What we need to do, we need our own channels to tell our stories from our own perspective. I think the day we do that, we'll do a better job. I mean, every year for the last 14 years, I've conducted a study called Brand Africa, Africa's Most Admired Brands. And every year we look at which are the most admired media brands. So in other words, who carries the African story. And BBC, CNN, France 24, and so you can tell that the people who are telling our story is not us. So what we can learn, I think the most important thing is we just need to take back the narrative. We need to take back the story and channel it ourselves. That's where we need to. And you invest in media, so we need to talk after this.
So,
go ahead, Gina. Yeah.
Sorry, let me just pick up on that. When we had, issues with our elections a few years ago, all the international media ascended onto Nairobi, Kenya, and they were there for the longest time during the protests and all the bad news that was happening. There was none that was an African international journalist. They were all from elsewhere. And when we finally did have a breakthrough and there was a consensus built, there was almost a sense of regret that these foreign journalists would have to leave, because they were quite happy to stay as long as they could from the safety of their hotels, visiting the national parks every day, but coming up with very, very negative news out of Kenya. And yet when there was good news, they seemed like they were quite disappointed. So it's really important that, we take back that narrative, that we own our story, that the stories about the continent are told by us.
Some of the things that, yes. Tebe and I were talking about were some of the impediments to growth, and it seems like some of the African countries are experiencing phenomenal growth, and others are languishing. Is there a common thread that connects those that are growing and also those who might be languishing? I'll leave it open to all of you. Maybe we'll begin with Tebe.
Well, I think, if you look at, as an Africans, we like to think that the leading African countries, Southern Africa obviously being South Africa, East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, North Africa being Morocco, Egypt, and West Africa being Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. So those countries, I think if there's a common thread around those countries, is I think they've got a very vibrant entrepreneurial culture. And because where you have a very vibrant entrepreneurial culture, you have the people taking charge of the opportunities. Because the countries which are perhaps not growing as fast or doing as well are perhaps those which are state-led, if you will, where the people are not leading, the entrepreneurs are not leading. I mean, we just did a study now recently to understand the key driver of the South Africa, just one example, the South African brand. And we've established that 87% of what drives the value of the country South Africa is the private sector. So they're in there, and 13% are being state and policies and all those. Therein is an example of what drives the nation. I mean, if you look at countries like Italy or even the United States of America, so whatever happens, whatever Trump says is really immaterial. The entrepreneurs are running the country. Yep. And similar what people say that Italy is so chaotic, it's a leaderless for a long time. Because, for a long time, Italy was changing leaders every week, but the country continued to run. So I think what we need to do is to just reinvest in the private sector and get the private sector to drive the growth of the countries. So that is, to me, the common thread around those, where there's a vibrant entrepreneurial culture and where people are driving the agenda rather than the governments driving the agenda.
Sanjay, Gina, any additional comments? So I would like to add the youth. Look at the countries and they are incredibly smart. Yeah. And I can talk about 16, 17 countries where I have visited. Incredibly smart. And so we were doing a media project in one of the countries, and the promoter said, "You are setting up all these high-tech things. Who will run it?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Do you want us to be dependent on you forever?" This was his exact question. I said, "No, your people would run it. Why do you say that?" He said, "I know my people." I said, "Then you don't know your people." And he was proven wrong. He is the president of one of the countries today as we speak, that gentleman. And So the youth, I think whichever the countries in Africa, and I am talking about this east and west and central part of Africa mostly, they have been drivers for growth, which in turn becomes entrepreneurship. And this is a famous thing about India. They say that by the time government of India could understand what is IT had already gone beyond their reach, so there was no ministry of IT. And they say that was one of the reasons why India grew so much. So I think youth.
We definitely need to lean into our youth globally.
Let's not forget that by 2050, Africa's workforce will be the largest in the world, very educated, English-speaking, and that's really, that's the best asset that we have, is our young population.
Who comprise 70% of the population. So we're very young people. And they say we'll have, I think, 40% of the world by 2050. And I was explaining to a friend that I was in one country, and the minister said to me in Uganda, I said, you don't have to worry about us Africans with babies. That we're going to do. It's not a problem. And I said to the one minister in Uganda, I said, Minister. The minister looked at me and says, Tebe, he says, you guys are slow. In Lesotho and Botswana, I don't understand what's happening in those countries. But if you look at Uganda, he says, we look at a woman, there's 8 babies right there. So we are going to run the population of the world. So, of course, as a cradle of humankind, all of us are from Africa. You guys are welcome to rebrand and rejoin and become African by then.
So there's institutions like the World Bank and African Development Bank, and they're dedicated to fostering economic growth and prosperity in Africa. Is it working? Or are they succeeding? Are they failing?
Should we ask the Kenyans? Because recently, as you remember, there was a massive... So while the Paris were preparing the Olympics in France, the Kenyans were running social Olympics against IMF and against the World Bank. Because what we've realized is that all these multilateral institutions, mostly what they've done is laden African countries with lots of debt, but not just debt, but also dictated what is development for those countries. Instead of going to those countries and asking those countries, how do you want to progress? They've come to the countries from Washington. Okay, I can live a country safely, right? I'll be okay if I say the truth, right?
We're amongst friends, absolutely.
They come to these countries and they give these countries an agenda of what is development for these countries. And I remember a specific example by one of these institutions. A friend of mine was running a big institution which was which was founded by one American institution. And he said, we've got so much money in the bank. Can we use the money for what we think is correct? They're like, no. We put the money in your bank and we're going to tell you where the money should be spent. And that is actually the problem. If you look at over 50 years of $1 trillion of debt, of aid, and all this, all it's done is create corruption, create a dependency, and has not enabled the continent to be able to drive its own agenda. I mean, in Zambia, for example, when the Zambians were not able to pay for the debt, China threatened to come and take the airport which they built. And that is the problem that we're facing. So IMF, World Bank, all those, I'm sure they are wonderful institutions. They're run by wonderful people who are raised very well. But unfortunately, they've created those institutions to drive their agenda rather than the agenda of the continent.
So related to that, and against the backdrop, really, yes, of Africans themselves telling their story. We're sitting here in the United States, so the question I have is, what role can Western countries, Western companies play in contributing to the growth of Africa without appearing to be, or without being neo-colonial even? Like, what role does the West have to play in this potentially very fruitful partnership?
So I think I think as Africans, we're looking more to be partners. We don't want to be the receivers of aid. So, for us, it's very much trade, not aid. And obviously, all African countries need foreign investment. It is the continent to invest in. but it has to be on equal terms. So, you know, it can't be companies coming in and dictating policy to the countries. It has to come in as equal partnerships. And we definitely need the foreign direct investment. We should also remember that we have very strong African diaspora. We have Africans living all over the world, all contributing. We have many Africans working in the United States, all contributing to the economy of the United States. So, you know, it is equal. It has to be a much more equal and balanced relationship.
Sanjay?
Paul Kagame said something quite interesting, because I think it was one of these multilaterals who did exactly what I said. They wanted to give them the money and dictate where the money should be invested. And Paul Kagame told them, President Kagame of Rwanda, he says, you can keep your money if you are trying to come and dictate to us what we should do with the money. So Gina is correct that it has to be as a partnership, because we are not, we shouldn't be seen as a charity case. We should rather be seen as a contributor to the globe, and which we are in many ways, because if you think about the continent, where would the Queen be with all the diamonds which came from Kimberley, where I was born? Where would Nestle be when there are chocolates and all those with other cocoa that comes from Cote d'Ivoire and come from Ghana? And where would, I mean, I can go from industry to industry and just illustrate how Africa has contributed a lot more to the world economy than the world has contributed to us. Chirac, the former president of France, put it so beautifully. He said, France will be a third world country without Africa.
So I'm gonna start with Sanjay. I'm gonna ask each of you the same cadence of a few questions as we draw to a close. What is your greatest hope for Africa?
Sorry?
What is your greatest hope for Africa?
So there are many numbers that what Africa would become, but just extending to what my co-panelist said. So when you are going to Africa and you ask that question about West, do not go to just visit Africa. First visit Africa, then if you are willing to do something in Africa, just do not visit. Go spend some time and then invest if you want to invest. So we are setting up, let's say, Netflix for Ethiopia in that language, in that culture, and we are doing a partnership with the National Telecom of Ethiopia. The challenge we found was that you can make money in local currency, which is birr, but you cannot send it outside, repatriate that money. Then how do you do it? So then we went and met everybody at the top level, and they said, oh, this is a genuine problem. We have a dollar issue, and many countries in Africa have issues of dollar. But if you go and work with them, if you show your genuinity that you really want to do this, then I think most of the leaders are very, very receptive to listen to what you want to do. And I see that the changing style of leadership, better leaders are great hope to me from Africa, and again, the youth of Africa.
Gina, what's your greatest hope for Africa?
So I think, you know, going back to what we've heard yesterday and today, I think the story of the culture of storytelling that Africans have, we need to take that back. And I think sharing the stage with Deepak and what he has done so well on narrative is really, really important. I think what he always says is, you know, we are who we say we are. And so we're looking forward to, as Africans, being who we say we are, owning the narrative. And I think it's been just a very powerful day. Tebe and I were talking earlier about how, you know, India has done so well in mainstreaming so many of the traditions that India has. And in Africa, we can do the same. So we talk about plant medicine, or there's so many things. Tebe, maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I was just talking about, thank you, Gina. I was just to add to Gina's comment that if you look at the concept of alternative medicine and all those, but whenever an African put forward an alternative idea, whether it is sangomas or all those things, then you get a cover, as the ambassador from Rwanda said yesterday, the cover will be saying witchcraft in Africa. But But if an Indian puts up an alternative, Deepak Chopra puts up an idea and he speaks big English, or somebody from China, and they come with their needles and they look and they put up, and they're like, wow, this is amazing. Let's go to Harvard. Let's put up a paper on it. But whenever Africa, but it speaks to the idea that us as Africans, we should not be asking for permissions for our ideas to be accepted. I think the problem that we've had for a long time is just that we've asked for permission.
Yes. So we've got.
I mean, and until then, we'll
Yep.
never be. Until then, we'll always be seen as our ideas are backward. I mean, we grew up, as Gina and I was speaking earlier, that growing up in where I grew up in Kimberley, we used to sit around the fireplace, and my grandmother used to tell us stories about, and the stories were always hopeful stories. Deepak was speaking earlier, were always hopeful stories. It was never sad stories, but that culture, that way of life, we've sort of lost it along the way because we've done something that in 1835, one of the British MPs said, the one thing that we need to do is to take away from the Africans their culture, their language, because as soon as they believe that anything that is English and foreign and Western is better, then we'll have them completely dominated. That's how the continent is what it is. So I'm not in the business of telling the West they must take responsibility for what they've done to the continent. I'm in the business of saying that us as Africans, we need to move forward with our own agenda, despite or irrespective of what the West thinks. And to remember the most important thing that I'll probably will leave everybody else here is everybody else has got a past, but we have a future.
Beautiful. So we have a minute left. If there's any parting, very brief parting comments each of you want to make to really leave the audience thinking about, I leave the floor to you.
I think there's a real urgency to reclaiming Africa's narrative. The world is waking up to the importance of emerging markets, and Africa stands at the forefront. So I think the time is now. It is the time for Africa. It's time for the West and for other countries to realize the strength and the future, as Tebe said. The future really is on our continent that I'm so fortunate to call home.
You know, I'm convinced that whether we like it or not, whether somebody helps or not, Africa is present. It has already started moving, and it's definitely the future, and a very bright future, like India had, and what India is going to become. I see between India and Africa, they would rule the world, rule not in the way we were ruled, rule the world in the
but it'll be nice.
In the nicer way.
It'll be nice just for a change.
Right. In the nicer way.
Well, you know, Emperor Jean Bedel Bokassa tried in Central Africa, you know, had a massive coronation, and he instructed the Queen to come and coronate and the Pope to come and bless. It didn't quite work out that way, it was pretty close. It'd be nice.
So one of the themes of this symposium is emergence, and it's just an honor to be with these three very esteemed panelists who are indicative of how Africa is truly emerging. And please give them all a big round of applause.
Thank you, Jade. So by the way, just stay tuned. I think we have one picture here. And then while they take the picture, I can speak and do things in parallel. The Chopra Foundation, March 2025, is going to have a retreat to Africa. Very limited number of people are going to go through a journey. It's going to be a spiritual experience. And if you want to sign up, please meet Salima, who's over here, you know, and then get in touch.